1 minute. That's all it took for everything inside the royal family to shift. Behind closed doors at Balmoral, away from cameras, away from tradition, something unprecedented unfolded. The keys to the hunting lodge, an estate wrapped in secrecy and legacy, were quietly placed into Catherine's hands. No announcement. No witnesses. Just silence. And in that silence, a decision that may have rewritten the future of the monarchy forever. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It didn't begin with ceremony. That's what makes it so unsettling. There was no procession, no carefully staged moment designed for public reassurance. Instead, there was urgency, an almost unnatural urgency that disrupted the carefully controlled rhythm the monarchy has maintained for generations. Catherine's presence at Balmoral itself had already raised quiet questions among those who understand how tightly these movements are usually managed. She wasn't expected. Not here. Not now. And yet, there she was, stepping into a space that has long been reserved for the most private and consequential royal decisions, as if drawn there by something far more deliberate than coincidence. The Balmoral hunting lodge has never been just another royal property. Those who know its history understand it carries a different kind of weight, one that doesn't show itself in public records or official speeches. It is a place where decisions are made without announcement, where power is quietly reassigned without explanation. To hand over its keys is not a gesture of convenience. It is a signal. A deeply coded message that only those within the inner circle are meant to fully grasp. And yet, this signal was sent without witnesses, without the usual figures who would validate such a transfer. That absence speaks louder than any presence ever could, because where were the aides? Where were the advisors, the senior royals, the individuals who traditionally stand as silent guarantors of these moments? Nowhere. Deliberately nowhere. The silence wasn't just around the event, it was built into it. And that kind of silence doesn't happen by accident. It is designed, controlled, enforced. Even those who were nearby, those who might have caught a glimpse of movement or sensed a shift in atmosphere, found themselves shut out almost instantly, as if an invisible line had been drawn the moment the keys changed hands. And then there was Catherine herself. Composed, as always, but not untouched. Those who observed her closely, even in passing, noted something different. A pause that lasted just a fraction too long. A hesitation that suggested the weight of what she was receiving was far greater than anyone outside that moment could fully understand. This wasn't a simple acceptance. It was an acknowledgement. A recognition of responsibility, of expectation, of something unspoken but undeniably present. Because when something like this happens in private, it means the real meaning cannot survive public scrutiny. What followed only deepened the mystery. Whispers began almost immediately, not loud, not reckless, but controlled, careful, contained. Staff members speaking in lowered tones, movements becoming more restricted, access tightening in ways that didn't align with any official explanation. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the flow of information stopped entirely. Locked down, sealed, as if whatever had just occurred was never meant to extend beyond those walls. But the real question wasn't just what happened, it was why now, and what hidden forces had been building toward this moment all along. To outsiders, it's just another royal property. But insiders know the Balmoral hunting lodge is something far more dangerous, far more symbolic. It has witnessed private decisions that never made it to history books. Power has shifted within its walls before, quietly, permanently. And now Catherine stands at the center of that same space, which raises a chilling question: what does owning this place really mean? Because this was never about land, or stone, or tradition preserved for appearances. The lodge exists in a different category entirely, one that operates beneath the visible structure of monarchy. where decisions are not announced but absorbed, not debated but sealed into silence. For decades, it has carried a reputation whispered rather than spoken, a place where conversations unfold without record and outcomes emerge without explanation. Those who have entered it under similar circumstances rarely leave unchanged, not publicly. But internally, something shifts, something irreversible. There have been moments, scattered across time, when the future of the crown subtly bent within those walls, not through grand declarations, but through quiet agreements, through unspoken understandings reached behind closed doors. It is said that succession itself has felt the weight of this place, not rewritten outright, but influenced, nudged, redirected in ways that only become clear years later. Patterns that seemed coincidental at the time begin to form a different picture when traced back to Balmoral, and more specifically to this lodge. And then there is the emotional gravity it carries. Monarchs before have retreated there, not for ceremony, but for clarity, for confrontation, for decisions too heavy to be made in the presence of expectation. The lodge has seen hesitation, doubt, even quiet resistance. It has held the moments where certainty was tested and, in some cases, broken. Which is why being entrusted with it is not a reward, it is a burden. A signal that one is no longer just participating in the monarchy, but shaping it, whether willingly or not. Perhaps most telling of all is its history of restriction. Access has never been casual. It is not a place one simply visits, it is a place one is permitted into, and only under circumstances that carry meaning. There have been figures expected to step inside who never did, and others, less expected, who were brought in at precisely the moment when something needed to change. The pattern is not random. It never has been. And now, Catherine's presence there doesn't just break expectation, it challenges it entirely. Because for all its legacy, for all its carefully guarded significance, Catherine was not the obvious choice, not the predictable one. And that is what makes this moment feel less like continuation and more like disruption. The weight of the lodge does not transfer lightly. It selects in its own way those who will carry its influence forward. And now, that influence rests with her, not publicly acknowledged, not formally declared, but undeniably real. Which leaves an unsettling realization lingering beneath the surface. If the lodge has always been a place where the future quietly takes shape, then Catherine's presence there is not just symbolic, it is strategic. And strategies like this are never born overnight. They are built, piece by piece, long before anyone realizes what they are leading toward. And yet, despite its legacy, Catherine was never expected to be the one standing at its center, which makes the events leading up to this moment even more unsettling. Catherine was never the loudest voice in the room. She didn't need to be. For years, she watched, learned, and waited, carefully stepping into her role, while others underestimated her influence. But what if that was always part of the plan? What if this moment, the keys, the silence, the secrecy, wasn't sudden at all, but the result of a long, calculated rise no one truly saw coming? Because long before the doors of Balmoral closed behind her, long before the weight of that quiet handover settled into something undeniable, Catherine had already begun transforming slowly, deliberately, almost invisibly. She entered the royal world as an outsider, someone expected to adapt, to follow, to fit into a structure that rarely bends for anyone. And at first, that is exactly what she appeared to do. She listened, she observed, she moved carefully, never rushing ahead, never drawing unnecessary attention. But beneath that calm exterior, something far more strategic was unfolding. Composure became her greatest weapon. While others reacted, she remained still. While tensions surfaced, she absorbed them without resistance. This wasn't passivity, it was control. A quiet kind of control that doesn't announce itself but reshapes the atmosphere around it. Over time, that consistency built something far more powerful than authority, it built trust. not the kind that is declared publicly, but the kind that is tested privately, in moments where decisions matter and pressure reveals true character. There were moments small, almost unnoticeable at the time, where Catherine stepped forward just enough to shift outcomes without appearing to do so. Situations that could have escalated, didn't. Dynamics that could have fractured, held together. And in each of those moments, her presence wasn't loud, but it was decisive. Those who paid close attention began to see a pattern forming. Not dominance, not ambition in the traditional sense, but something far more effective, a steady positioning that made her indispensable without ever seeming overpowering. And then there were the relationships, carefully built, quietly maintained, and deeply influential. Trust within the royal family is not easily given, and even harder to sustain. Yet Catherine seemed to move through those inner circles with a level of acceptance that others struggled to achieve. Not because she demanded it, but because she earned it. Over time, that trust began to shift from personal to institutional. She was no longer just seen as part of the family, she was becoming part of its foundation. But what the public saw was something entirely different. Polished appearances, measured words, a figure defined by grace and restraint. And while that image was not false, it was incomplete. Because behind that carefully maintained perception was a growing influence that extended far beyond what anyone outside could fully grasp. The real Catherine, the one making subtle decisions, navigating unseen tensions, preparing for moments like this, remained just out of reach, hidden behind a narrative that never quite told the full story. Which brings everything back to the present. The keys, the silence, the deliberate absence of acknowledgement. None of it feels accidental anymore, not when viewed through the lens of everything that came before. Because this wasn't a sudden rise, it was a culmination. A moment that had been quietly building, step by step, choice by choice, long before anyone realized what it was leading toward. And now, standing at the center of a decision that carries more weight than anyone is willing to openly admit, Catherine is no longer just part of the story, she is shaping it. Not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably. And that is precisely what makes this moment so powerful and so deeply unsettling. Because behind every quiet rise, there are louder tensions waiting to erupt, and not everyone inside the palace was ready for what happened next. The keys didn't just unlock a door, they triggered a ripple effect across the royal family. Because in a system built on hierarchy and protocol, being left out isn't just an oversight, it's a message. And this message was loud. Certain names were missing from that room. Certain individuals were not informed. And now, the silence is beginning to feel deliberate. Because in a structure as carefully balanced as the monarchy, absence carries meaning. Every presence is calculated, every invitation deliberate, every exclusion intentional. And what makes this moment so volatile is not just who was there, but who wasn't. Senior figures, individuals whose roles would normally place them at the center of any significant transition, found themselves on the outside. Not delayed, not consulted, simply bypassed. And in royal terms, that kind of bypass is not procedural, it's personal. The disruption this created wasn't immediate or explosive. It was quieter than that, and far more dangerous. A shift in energy behind closed doors, conversations that suddenly stopped when certain names were mentioned, a recalibration of tone, as if everyone was trying to understand a new reality without openly acknowledging it. Because when hierarchy is disrupted without warning, it doesn't just create confusion, it creates instability. And instability within the monarchy is never allowed to surface. Even when it's deeply felt, reactions began to form, not publicly, but in fragments. A raised question here, a withheld response there. Subtle, controlled responses that masked something much sharper beneath the surface. For some, the handover represented a clear signal, an indication that the balance of influence was shifting in ways they had not anticipated. For others, it felt like something closer to displacement. Not official, not declared, but sensed. And that sense, once it takes hold, is difficult to contain. Because exclusion doesn't just affect position, it affects perception. It forces those left out to reconsider where they stand, what they represent, and how secure their place truly is. And in a family where perception is as powerful as reality, that kind of doubt spreads quickly. It lingers. It reshapes interactions. It turns silence into suspicion. And slowly, without any formal acknowledgement, a line begins to form, one that separates those who were included in the moment from those who were not. And at the center of it all is Catherine. Not by declaration, not by confrontation, but by consequence. Her elevation, quiet as it was, has begun to cast a longer shadow than anyone might have expected. Because when one figure rises without warning, it inevitably creates pressure elsewhere. Questions begin to surface, comparisons begin to form, and with them, the possibility of rivalry, not overt, not aggressive, but deeply rooted in shifting influence. What makes this even more unsettling is the lack of clarity. No explanation, no official narrative to stabilize the situation, just silence. And in that silence, interpretations multiply, each one slightly different, each one carrying its own version of truth. And as those interpretations spread, so does the sense that something fundamental has changed, something that cannot be easily reversed or quietly forgotten. Because once exclusion becomes visible, it cannot be unseen. It reshapes trust, it alters expectations, and it forces everyone within that system to reassess not just what happened, but what it means for what comes next. And right now, that meaning is still unfolding, still uncertain, still quietly escalating beneath the surface. But exclusion is rarely accidental in royal circles, which leads to an even deeper question: who orchestrated this, and what were they trying to secure? No royal decision happens in isolation, especially not one this significant. So if Catherine received the keys, someone had to authorize it. But here's where things take a darker turn, because the identity of that decision-maker isn't being openly discussed. It's being protected, hidden. And the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't just a handover. It was a strategic move. Because within the monarchy, authority is never as simple as it appears. Decisions flow through layers, some visible, many not. There are formal structures, of course, carefully maintained to preserve order and tradition. But beneath those structures exists something far more complex, a network of influence where timing, loyalty, and long-term vision quietly shape outcomes long before they are ever acted upon. And in moments like this, it is that hidden network that becomes impossible to ignore. The transfer of something as symbolically loaded as the Balmoral hunting lodge would never occur without alignment at the highest levels. Not just approval, but agreement carefully measured, deliberately timed. Yet what makes this moment so unsettling is the absence of any clear trace of that approval. No visible documentation, no formal acknowledgement, no controlled narrative to guide interpretation. It's as if the decision was made and then intentionally erased from the surface. Which raises a troubling possibility. What if this wasn't meant to be seen at all? What if the handover was designed to exist only within a confined circle, known only to those who needed to know, and hidden from those who didn't? Because in a system where information is power, controlling what is not said can be just as significant as what is openly declared. And right now, what's not being said is deafening. There are whispers, careful, fragmented suggestions that the approval may have come under pressure, or perhaps under urgency. A last-minute decision, made in response to something unfolding behind the scenes. Not reactive in the traditional sense, but accelerated. As if a timeline that had been building quietly for years suddenly reached a point where delay was no longer an option. And in that moment, the choice was made, swiftly, silently, and without the usual safeguards. But even more intriguing is the question of why Catherine, because in a system driven by continuity and predictability, selecting her for something this significant signals more than trust, it signals intent. A positioning. A deliberate move that suggests she is being placed not just within the structure, but at a critical point inside it. And that kind of positioning is never accidental. It reflects a vision, a direction, a future that is being shaped before it is publicly understood. Yet not all signs point to harmony. Beneath the surface, there are subtle indications of tension, small inconsistencies that hint at disagreement rather than unity. A decision like this, carried out with such precision yet surrounded by such silence, suggests that while some forces were aligned, others may have been left out or even overruled. And that kind of internal imbalance doesn't disappear, it lingers, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Which brings everything back to the central realization: this was never just about transferring keys. It was about consolidating influence, about placing someone in a position where their presence carries weight far beyond what is publicly visible. And when that kind of move is made quietly, it often means the real impact is still to come. And if this was a strategy, then it wasn't just about property, it was about the future, and who is being positioned to control it. The monarchy doesn't change overnight, or at least it isn't supposed to. But sometimes, a single moment quietly redraws everything. And this might be that moment, because handing Catherine the keys to Balmoral's most symbolic lodge doesn't just give her access, it gives her authority, influence, presence, and perhaps a role far greater than anyone publicly admits. Because within an institution built on continuity, even the smallest shift carries weight. And this was not small. This was a movement so subtle, it almost escaped notice, yet powerful enough to alter perception at its core. Catherine is no longer simply moving within the structure. She is beginning to define it. Not through declarations, not through visible assertion, but through positioning, through placement, through being entrusted with something that has historically belonged only to those standing closest to the center of power. That shift changes everything. It redefines how she is seen, not just by the public, but by those within the monarchy itself. Because influence in this world is rarely announced, it is recognized. And recognition begins in moments like this, where trust is extended in ways that cannot be easily explained or reversed. The keys were not just handed over, they were placed with intention, with purpose, and that purpose speaks louder than any formal title ever could. With that comes expectation, a new layer of responsibility that is not written, not outlined, but deeply understood. Catherine is no longer operating within the boundaries that once defined her role. Those boundaries have expanded, quietly, but unmistakably. And with that expansion comes pressure, the kind that doesn't show itself outwardly, but builds internally, shaping decisions, influencing instincts, forcing choices that will carry consequences far beyond the present moment. There is also the question of perception. Publicly, this may appear as a gesture of trust, a symbolic extension of confidence. But privately, it carries a different weight entirely. It suggests movement, direction, a subtle repositioning that begins to shape how the future is imagined, even if no one openly acknowledges it. Because once a figure is placed this close to the center, it becomes impossible to ignore what that placement implies. And then there is the psychological transformation. To be entrusted with something so deeply embedded in the monarchy's hidden framework is not just an honor, it is a test. A moment that demands adaptation, resilience, and an understanding of power that goes beyond appearances. Catherine now stands in a position where every decision, every silence, every action carries amplified meaning. And that awareness changes a person. It sharpens them. It isolates them. It forces them to see the structure not as it is presented, but as it truly operates. Which leads to the most unsettling possibility of all. Is Catherine becoming a stabilizing force within a shifting system, or something far more dominant. Because power, when given in this way, does not remain neutral. It evolves, it expands, it demands to be used. And how it is used will determine not just her future, but the future of the monarchy itself. And yet, even as this transformation unfolds, one truth remains impossible to ignore. No shift in power exists without consequence. Every rise creates imbalance. Every repositioning invites reaction. And beneath the surface, those reactions are already beginning to form quietly, carefully, but inevitably. But power, once given, doesn't exist in isolation. It attracts resistance, scrutiny, and sometimes silent opposition. No statement, no clarification, not even a denial. In the world of royalty, silence is never empty, it's intentional. And right now, that silence is louder than any announcement could ever be. Because when something this significant happens, and no one speaks, it means one thing: there's more beneath the surface than anyone is willing to reveal. Because in a system built on precision, where even the smallest gesture is curated and every word is weighed before it is released, the absence of communication is never accidental. It is a decision, a deliberate withholding, and that withholding carries its own kind of message, one that doesn't reassure, but unsettles. The palace knows how to respond to speculation. It knows how to guide narratives, how to shape perception. And yet, in this moment, it has chosen not to. That choice alone is enough to raise questions that no official statement could ever fully contain. What makes this even more unsettling is how controlled the surrounding narrative has become. The media, often quick to fill gaps with interpretation, appears cautious, measured in a way that suggests boundaries have been quietly reinforced. Not silence enforced through force, but through understanding. Through signals that certain lines are not meant to be crossed. And when those signals are followed without resistance, it creates an atmosphere where information doesn't disappear, it simply stops moving. Because silence in this context is not emptiness, it is strategy. It allows the monarchy to hold control without revealing its hand. To let speculation rise just enough to distract, but never enough to expose what truly matters. It creates distance between the event and its meaning, stretching that distance until clarity becomes impossible. And within that space, power is preserved not through explanation, but through ambiguity. Internally, the pressure to maintain that silence becomes even more intense. Those closest to the situation understand the stakes. They know that breaking the quiet is not just about speaking, it's about shifting balance. And so, the silence holds, carefully, tightly, even as questions build beneath it, even as curiosity begins to press against the edges of what can realistically be contained. But outside those walls, the effect is different. The public doesn't experience silence as control, they experience it as tension, as something unresolved. The lack of answers doesn't close the story, it expands it. Every unanswered question becomes an opening for interpretation, for speculation, for theories that grow more complex with every passing moment. And the longer that silence remains, the more powerful those questions become. Because uncertainty has a way of pulling people in. It invites attention. It demands understanding. And when that understanding is denied, it transforms into something else entirely, something sharper, more persistent. The event itself begins to fade into the background, replaced by the mystery surrounding it. Not what happened, but why it isn't being explained. Not the action, but the refusal to acknowledge its meaning. And that is where the real tension lies. Not in the handover itself, but in the void that followed it. A void that feels too deliberate to ignore, too controlled to be accidental. It suggests that whatever took place carries implications far greater than what can be publicly addressed. That speaking openly would reveal something the institution is not ready or not willing to confront. And as that silence continues to stretch, Becoming heavier with each passing moment, it begins to reshape the narrative entirely. What was once a single contained event now feels like the center of something much larger, something still unfolding, something not yet fully visible. And as the silence stretches on, one final question begins to take shape. Was this really the end of a moment, or the beginning of something far more disruptive? Moments like this don't fade, they echo, and what happened at Balmoral may not be fully understood yet, but its consequences are already unfolding. Because when power shifts quietly, it doesn't stay quiet for long. The doors that opened for Catherine may soon close for others. And as alliances begin to shift, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. This was never just about keys. Because what has been set in motion now extends far beyond a single decision, far beyond a private exchange hidden from public view. The monarchy operates on balance, delicate, calculated, constantly maintained. And when that balance is disturbed, even in the smallest way, the effects don't remain contained. They ripple outward, touching relationships, altering loyalties, forcing adjustments that no one openly acknowledges but everyone feels. And right now, those adjustments have already begun. There is a quiet recalibration taking place within the inner circle, not dramatic, not visible, but deeply significant. Positions are being reconsidered. Roles are being re-evaluated. Those who once felt secure are beginning to sense uncertainty, while others, perhaps unexpectedly, find themselves closer to the center than ever before. And at the heart of it all is Catherine no longer just participating in the system, but influencing how it evolves. But influence invites attention, and attention invites scrutiny. Every move she makes from this point forward will carry weight more than before, more than anyone may be willing to admit publicly. Her decisions will be watched, not just by the public, but by those within the monarchy who are trying to understand what her rise truly means. Because when someone steps into a position like this, it forces everyone else to reassess their own. There is also the question of what comes next. Moments like this rarely exist in isolation. They lead somewhere, they build towards something. And already there are signs, subtle, almost imperceptible, that this was only the beginning. That further decisions may follow. That confirmations, whether direct or indirect, may eventually surface. And when they do, they will either reinforce what has already been set in motion or expose just how deep this shift truly goes. Emotionally, the impact is just as significant. Beneath the structure, beneath the protocol, there is a family, and within that family, dynamics that are constantly shifting, constantly being tested. Trust, once steady, is now being questioned. Alignment, once assumed, now feels uncertain, and those emotional undercurrents, though hidden, have a way of influencing everything that follows. Because when tension exists at that level, it doesn't stay contained forever. And that is where the real risk begins to emerge. Not in what has already happened, but in what could happen next. Because if these internal shifts continue, if the pressure continues to build, there is a possibility, however carefully avoided, that fractures could begin to surface. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, in ways that become harder and harder to conceal. Which leads to the most powerful realization of all: this moment was never an end point. It was a beginning, a turning point that marks the start of something larger, something more complex, something that will continue to unfold long after the initial silence fades. The keys were simply the trigger, the visible sign of a transformation that had been building quietly for far longer than anyone realized. And now, that transformation is no longer hidden. It is moving, expanding, reshaping the structure from within, and whether it stabilizes the monarchy or challenges it in ways no one is prepared for, remains to be seen. Because in the end, the keys didn't just unlock a lodge, they unlocked a future the monarchy may never be able to reverse. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.